Data Storytellers. Today, I'm here with David Rotenberg, who is the Director of Data Strategy and Business Intelligence over at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health. So a little bit of a different flavor to what we're used to, but I'm excited to get into the conversation. Great to have you with us, David.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Paul. Really excited to talk to you.
To start with, just tell us a little bit about your role, your background, your current job, what you're up to.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think my journey is a bit less traditional than perhaps some others in the data space. My original background was in physics. Obviously, data plays a big role in that, sort of from the abstract to quantum to astro. But what I was really motivated by was how could we help people and have a very immediate impact. And so I sort of branched out into medical physics, and that's really the application of these concepts to medicine, looking at MRI, for example. And if you're familiar, MRI it's data. Ultimately, it's big blocks of images, and it's really interesting to compute them. And so I sort of leaned into these bigger questions of how we deal with these types of data and integrate them across all these different research modalities. So genetics, different types of imaging, PET, CT, and all the way through to clinical. So we're embedded in the Center for Addiction and Mental Health. We have access to some phenomenal clinical records, but how do we mine those and how do we integrate them to make sense of them in the context of understanding mental illness? So I sort of ended up building a lot of different data systems to help on the research side, but ultimately on the clinical side as well. And importantly, the integration. So right now, my role is Director of Data Strategy, overseeing all of our data assets, corporate, clinical research, but really trying to drive value in how they can be used together with common types of data models and governance approaches.
Mm. And it's interesting because it's not really the field that you would expect data analytics to be in. What kind of made the CAMH look for this role, or was it created? How did that come about?
That's an excellent question. I mean, fundamentally, we're an operating hospital, so we have a lot of core questions about how many beds are we using? Can we predict the traffic in our ER, for example? So a lot of very practical data questions that we ask at that side. Research, of course, is just driven by data. And I think the real challenge is that we don't know, and by we, I mean the broader community of psychiatrists and mental health researchers, don't know what causes mental illness. It's still a mystery. And so one of the ways we, of course, look to tackle this is by pulling across lots of different types of data across the entire hierarchy of the brain, from genes to small microcircuits to whole brain dynamics, all the way through to how patients interact with the clinic. So there's some big unanswered questions, and that's really what our mandate is.
Mm. Interesting. So it's almost like the art of healthcare, right? Is if you have all these data points, but you're not really sure the root cause, there's a lot more that needs to be done in this space, right? So how are you seeing the impact of data analytics over at the Center for Mental Health Addiction?
So it's really profound in a few ways. And when I talk about not understanding the cause of mental illness, what we firmly believe is that there are biological causes, that if we can identify what those are, just like other types of acute disorders, we can also tackle this other big problem, which is stigma. And it's really about demystifying this disorder, but also using that to hone in on what services we should be designing, how we should be putting together the different platforms and measurement platforms as well. So it's really very, very integrated into solving these questions, removing stigma. And then, of course, there's the fundamental operations of the hospital. So this is the nuts and bolts of what is our financial performance? What are we doing on a day-to-day basis? And data is driving all of those.
Mm. So where do you think data can help to play the part in removing the stigma?
So I think fundamentally, it's about mechanism. So when we built the Crumble Center, I'm also operations director of that research center. We brought together scientists who would deal specifically with data, with analytics and computational science at each sort of nexus of the brain's hierarchy. So accepting that it's this big, complicated biological system, there's data points that are quite different across these different domains. So again, from the genetics side, how that will then perhaps change the dynamics of an individual cell, how that cell could then interact in microcircuitry, how those individual changes can then impact the whole brain. So we're really trying to create this chain of events, this causal chain of events. And each team can then also look at data to, in effect, look at each other's work, sort of cross-check between in different directions to look again at the possibility of mechanism. So really grounding it in data and in fact, and going across this chain.
And essentially, what you're going through there is like a data transformation, right? Is that you're taking something that's not so well understood, and you're trying to use data to optimize the approaches for that. So, how can you just talk a bit about how that transformation has gone down in CAMH?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it was sort of inevitable. So when I was working in my first role, really looking at imaging genetics and also setting up our first computational infrastructure, it was just clear that the volume of data and the computational methods we would have to use to solve these problems was just getting greater and greater. So we made substantial investments into our capabilities, but very much so into the people. And the Krembil Center is kind of a synthesis of that. We've invested certainly in the hardware to store these things, but it's really in bringing in the talent who can lead this transformation from that very specific modality, but then integrated perspective. What I'll also note is a big focus of our recent work is on creating this learning healthcare system model. And I don't know if that's been talked about as much through Data Storytellers before, but really what we're looking at is applying the scientific research method to iterating on the healthcare that we provide. And psychiatry practically is not as often data driven as perhaps some other acute medicines. So really what we're looking at doing is having this very common term in other industries, but data driven approach to psychiatry, really using clear measurements of individual self-reports. So really this, in the context of psychiatry, is referred to as measurement-based care. So that really is getting people to report on their individual perceptions, because everything that's happening ultimately is related to our individual perceptions of what's happening. So these are used to then drive real-time decision support dashboards we've built that are embedded in the chart. So our team organizes those data, create pathways that are basically sequences of measurements that are timed based on best practice, and then visualize that over time for individual patients. So we're running this now for about 12,000 different patients at the hospital. Physicians just log in, and now they can see this visualization of individual trajectories with all these different measures that are most relevant to them and the particular diagnosis, and then make decisions. So for example, if they have a particular rating on a particular scale, it's recommended they now change the dosage of medication. And so we're really trying to bring this whole system from the research arm directly into the hands of physicians in a very tangible way.
And that was a great summary of what you guys are trying to do. What I'd also like to talk about is, what role were you playing in this? What kind of the biggest challenges you're seeing? Are they focused on the technology? Are they focused on the process? Are they focused on the patients or the other stakeholders? Where do you see those challenges right now?
Yeah, so I think as always, the technology is the easy part. We can build just about everything, but I think that these patient level dashboards are a good example of some of the challenges we have. So when we're dealing with patient data, obviously it's incredibly sensitive. So there's this significant layer of privacy, de-identification, processes and controls that are just an essential piece of it. But it's really communicating the value of something that's relatively new to a whole field, and getting buy-in from leadership that the economics of this works, all the way down to physicians who are now being asked to, in effect, change their practice in something that is very different from some of their traditional training. And so we have gone to lengths to introduce different types of educational materials. Obviously, clinicians are super, super well-versed, super bright people in their field, but they may not be touching data in this way. And so we've worked with them to build out these curricula that make sense for people who are really starting out with this type of view. And so it's been a true collaboration throughout the entire organization, from the pure data side, working with clinical applications, working with our business stakeholders, working with senior leadership to really drive this type of change, because we do feel that this attempt at measurement-based care really will change the field. It's really putting clear data-driven decision into the pathway for psychiatry, which is still relatively rare, generally in this type of medicine.
Yeah, and what I'd also be interested to figure out is actually the initial inertia for those conversations. So, okay, you guys decide to have a data function, you implement the technology. How do you go about like getting those people on board?
It's a great question. I find there's always this bell curve, the sort of traditional bell curve of first adopters, the people who will be excited when they see something, when they can kind of get an idea of what it looks like tangibly, and then the folks who are going to only go along with it when everyone's on board. And so we really focus our first energy on who are those first movers, who's ready to do this, who gets the vision. And it's really selling that type of comparatively radical approach to a small subset of people who are really motivated to push the boundaries. And then you're building up credibility. So we started small. We started with one specific pathway, a particular disorder, with relatively large population to test out all of these things, get it right, and also finding groups that are willing to iterate with you. I think is critical, who understand that these types of things, by the nature of a learning healthcare system, needs to learn. We're not intending to get it right the first time. We're trying to make sure we build something that lasts and is iterable by nature, so we can continue to refine it as we bring on new types of questions and challenges. And again, when you have something tangible, you can actually show people what these look like, and you can kind of see the excitement in the room that, wow, we can actually get the data more readily. And I'd also sort of clarify that the alternative to these types of visualizations is digging through a relatively unresponsive, kind of bulky chart. And EMRs aren't really designed for this. They're designed to sort of hold a record, and more so for things like billing. But they're not amenable to pulling data out cleanly or creating these types of visualizations that are also appropriate for behavioral health, which is also in a way a niche. So being able to see things rather than digging for it is already sort of groundbreaking for some folks. But then being able to see how clinicians have adopted this into their practice, how it's improving outcomes, that's really where we get to the value, that sort of medical value, and really making people sort of winning hearts and minds.
And you mentioned a lot of this is about helping people for you. How influential do you think was your like medical background in terms of leveraging this data strategy?
Great question. So certainly from the research side, part of the program that I did my graduate work in, medical biophysics, was really designed to bring together physicists with biologists and vice versa, and sort of cross these streams and almost force groups who have scientific inklings but different backgrounds to figure out how you can work together. And I think that's been a really big turning point in my career and how I look at problems, because I'm always trying to identify how Group A and how Group B can really integrate at that data level, but ultimately we're steering in the same direction. We want to drive better patient outcomes. We want to make things easier for our physicians and the populations we serve. So I think that pivot and that ability to take a different frame of mind, but then try and see where they're complementary, has been helpful across everything I've done, but certainly when it comes to data, and certainly when it comes to multimodal data and how to drive value from it.
And just going back to stakeholders, unlike a lot of the private companies we work with, for example, one extra stakeholder you're going to have to work with and engage and get on board is the both federal and provincial government, I imagine, right? You guys are publicly funded. So how has that element played into the equation of leveraging a data strategy?
That's a really excellent question. So there really is some fundamental bread and butter that we need to report on. So I didn't talk about reporting, but it's a sort of foundational thing we still run through the shop. So how many beds are we using? Really core metrics that need to be available for our Ministry of Health. We also play some other strategic roles at the data level. So for example, one of the pathways we run, the Ontario Structured Psychotherapy Program, is a provincial program. We run it through the technology. We have a similar dashboard for patients. So we interact at that level to try and spread what we see as being valuable for our patients, but to other organizations. On the other side, we also provide direct services. It's kind of a strange niche that we hold, but financial reporting actually for the health service providers in Ontario, particularly for Toronto, are run through our shop. So we have a lot of linkages between the work that we do, very foundational for our hospital, but also services we provide to external groups at the federal and provincial levels. Beyond that, of course, CAMH has a very clear mandate. I think its brand is very strong. And so we're always looking for opportunities for funding, which we receive. So
Mm.
a lot of our grants are at the federal level. One of the platforms we're building now is Health Canada funded or other provincial sources. So it's a combination of both being core funded, providing services through collaborations, and then really benefiting from showing what we can do for additional funding for specific projects or expansions.
Yeah, and it sounds like you guys are doing a lot of super interesting stuff here. One thing I'd be interested to know is, at this point, as we sit here talking today, where do you think are some of the greatest opportunities for the data strategy moving forward?
So I think there's two core pieces, and I hope I remember both. First is artificial intelligence, and it's obviously very, very popular in different fields, but we do see this as being very useful in the dashboards I was referring to. So we've created, rather than business intelligence, health intelligence as a new
Mm.
group to really champion these types of applications. And that encompasses both these individual trajectory visualizations, but embedding AI directly into them. And obviously, that's a challenge for lots of reasons. This is not an Amazon recommender. This isn't choosing between different pairs of socks. This is whether you're going to get a medication that can help you or perhaps be significantly detrimental. So for that, of course, we spend a lot of time on governance, which is a combination of these on-ramps. So how do we get good ideas? How do we get the right stakeholders at the table to make upfront decisions, but also a series of off-ramps where we can very clearly say, this is not working. The bias is too high. There are risks here, or the performance is not appropriate. And so this has been sort of the foundation. Again, technology is the easy part. We can create tons of models, but making sure we can responsibly apply it in the context of mental health has been really significant. The other part is broader scale data integration. And when I speak to patients or friends or colleagues, they're really surprised that in Canada and Ontario, this single health payer system, that records are still so fractured. It's kind of almost expected that if I go over to hospital A, they'll have the same information hospital B has for continuity of care, but that is not the case. And unfortunately, we're still a ways away from doing that. We've tried to standardize our data models on interoperable representations that allow us to do that, as well as working with other organizations to create broader sets of data that can be really shared, not at the data level, but through federated machine learning, which is where you're not really sending the data from place to place, you're keeping it resident where it is, but you're passing along ostensibly the weights of the ML models. And that allows you to get insight from broader data sets, but not exposing individuals to potential risk. So it's really been those two types of avenues, is creating the governance to allow us to do these types of things, but pushing the envelope a bit on how we can get to bigger data sets, really pooling together the information that unfortunately is still relatively siloed.
And if you look at that end-to-end journey, how important do you think the soft skills side of things were? Like things like, engaging and aligning key stakeholders is the challenge, like breaking down silos, but using influence and communication and persuasion to do that. How important was that for you guys?
Absolutely critical. I think, it's impossible to do things without the support of other people. It really comes down to understanding what value you're providing as a data shop to a group of stakeholders, whether within your organization or beyond, and creating those key human connections. So it can't be overstated how critical that is. I think the core principle for me has always just been empathy. Obviously, in healthcare, we assume, and of course, I think it's the case, we have a very common goal of helping to drive medicine forward, but it's a complicated environment. So just sitting down, understanding what people actually want, what the pressures are from their own organization, how they're interacting with the province or the government in different types of projects is essential to moving things forward. But I think part of our success has been really just looking for opportunities that are mutually advantageous, be that at the sort of program level for different types of initiatives, or just within a group really needs to just see some key data. Can we deliver that to them based on what their business processes are? So can't be overstated. Relationships are key to everything we do. I think soft skills are more the heart of it than anything, because the technology has come so far these days.
Mm.
that becomes a bit more trivial.
Yeah, and relationship building is obviously the key to data transformation. What are some of the like, for example, yeah, it's good to have humility, but also you need to be courageous. How do you go about like balancing those two? For example, being proactive with being the purveyor of the truth in the organization as a data leader,
Mm,
but also balancing that with the needs, wants, and motivations of the other people.
that's a great question. So part of this is, you have to bring them along the journey with you.
Mm,
Because the first thing that happens if you throw up a graph with a number, a number is just a number. And it's the story you tell, it's the narrative you pull away from it that helps with the interpretation. And so we find when we have a new project of any scale, we really want to have both the top-down clarity on vision and support, because it takes a lot of time from different teams to make these things happen, but from the data stewards as well. Not only do they understand the business, typically, deeply, but they need to have confidence in each step of the way as well, so they can also defend it. So often when we're presenting these types of projects, we're not necessarily presenting them. We're facilitating. We're making sure that we do the
mm,
best we can to put everything in place, but we're letting the groups champion it because they're really the intellectual purveyors of the information. They're also helping with the interpretation and some of that narrative. So we're involved in different ways, but foundationally, we really try and empower groups with the types of technology and with the expertise we provide to do the best work that they can do.
mm. So a big word that comes up is it tends to be like data drivenness. So how would you
Mhm.
define if and when you guys are, or how data driven you guys are within CAMH?
It's a great question. So I guess it depends a little bit on who you ask. I think that we have the systems and we have a lot of clear buy-in, but there's also a long way to go. I think that it's always down to what questions are you asking? Um, Again, the data have complications, as I'm sure has been discussed before, in terms of quality and getting everything streamlined. Um, but really, it's accepting that the data points we have are reliable, and we can make decisions based on those. And that is variable depending on the particular group. We are, I don't know if you are familiar with these classifications, but HIMSS 7, HIMSS MM6. So that's sort of a reference point to our degree of data drivenness, if you will, from a particular perspective. But it really does boil down to the culture and whether, again, we're able to sort of accept the data that we see, confident enough to put narratives on it, knowing our business rules, and moving forward with those particular decisions.
Mm. So what role do you think that people like yourself, heads of functions, the essentially like the chief data officers, play in these transformations today? Are they how would you characterize those roles?
That's another good question. So I think it always is evolving. Um, I think in terms of what I've seen my role to be, um, it's both a facilitator, making sure people are able to do the best they can do, but also sometimes a bit of a renegade in the sense of putting things forward that maybe are a bit outside of the box, but that have potential to really change the environment. So when I was referring to the research data, we created a platform to organize these. And enterprise data warehouses are pretty common. Research data warehouses are less so. And so we created a system that allowed us to organize these data, but also to stage them for reuse. And the secondary reuse of research data is a massively advantageous approach because it lets you collect once, very expensive process, and a burden to participants who are sort of donating their data, and
Mm,
researchers who spend their time collecting it, but then reusing it downstream and also integrating it with different research studies that are existing across the organization. So that was pretty radical at the time. Now it's effectively being mandated, so we were ahead of the curve.
mm,
Um, so that was pushing the envelope a bit. I'd say the same thing for the patient level dashboards. Again, it's a technology, so I won't overemphasize that. But being able to say, you know what, we're going to now visualize individual patient data and put that in your hands was comparatively radical at the time. And so I think what we always try and do is push the envelope where we think there's going to be real value downstream, but always looking for those first adopters who can really see the potential,
mm.
for a broad enough swath of the business to move it forward.
Yes, and that's like the stakeholder engagement piece. And obviously, you guys are a huge organization. How do you approach the education of the wider organization, say after the first adopters point?
That's a good question too. So there's a few ways. One is the sort of traditional roadshow. Again, what we prefer to do is to put it in the hands of those first adopters. These are really their projects. It's their groups. They've done a lot of the foundational work, I would say. So often they're helping us to present these to different groups. Typically, it's their peers first. So the measurement-based care pathways are a very good example. Everyone's trying to adopt them, but here's how far you can take it. Not only can you do high quality measurement, not only can you organize it in a way that makes sense and is standardized, but you can also visualize it and embed it in this way. So it's kind of giving them a flavor of what can be done and then bring them on board. In fact, we actually had way too many requests after we started doing this. So we had to sort of rethink how we could design some of these things because of the volume of interest. But it really is taking a key pilot with good high quality data, doing absolutely the best work we can to prove this model, and then sort of working with those stakeholders who are similarly motivated to demonstrate it to other groups.
Absolutely. So, David, it sounds like you're doing a bunch of really interesting stuff. I have a couple more questions for you. What really made you pivot or go down this route of data analytics? Because you're still here, so you must enjoy it. What do you like most about your job?
Lots of things. I think part of it is the potential of what we can do. We spent a lot of time upfront collecting data, putting it into place, but we've really only scratched the surface of generally mental health care and understanding it. So I'm really motivated by these deep questions and understanding how we can have an impact. I think we're going to do it through data. I think that's the key motivation. The other is it's phenomenal culture. Certainly at CAMH, a real belief in mental health is health, and helping to drive that mission forward. There's a big role that's played as well at the sort of provincial and policy level. So when we're able to say, this type of treatment is effective, or this is a major observation at a large population level in the province or beyond, that has a direct impact on how the province may respond to create legislation. And so there's just a massive amount of potential and sort of untapped information that is deeply, deeply motivating to me.
So what are the next steps in the data transformation? What important project are you currently working on? What are you most excited about?
So there are a few. So certainly the role of AI continues to be of significant interest, putting together the governance structure to allow us to do it responsibly. We were also awarded a recent grant to create a national data platform for mental health, particularly in youth, actually building off of the work we had done to sort of express and model our health records internally. This will launch in 5 provinces, so BC, Alberta, Ontario, Quebec, and Nova Scotia. And we face the same kind of challenges I think we already touched on, standardization, governance, all these things. But the potential of being able to combine information theoretically across provinces for mental health is pretty profound. So that's going to be a major road ahead for us. But I think it speaks also to the national direction of trying to bring these data together, despite some of the core challenges, under the right governance to affect substantial change.
So what advice would you give for aspiring leaders in data and analytics, particularly those who want to get into the healthcare space?
So talk to people, get to know as many people as you can. No one is an expert in all things, but it's important to always have that open ear, because really, I do see this as being in service of others, either those direct your stakeholders or downstream patients. And so learn as much as you can about the business, but really work on building those relationships and understanding what the real pain points are, where you can provide the most value. That isn't always obvious from an outsider, could surprise you. I think that's the most important principle that I've learned.
Well, David, it's been a genuine pleasure speaking with you. Some really great insights there, and hopefully we'll have you on again soon.
Sounds great. Thank you, Paul.